So let's look at the basics then of the DB structure. We've already alluded to the fact that these are set up and governed under a trust arrangement. So the assets of the pension are essentially owned and held by trustees who hold the scheme property for the benefit of the scheme members. So they must administer the trust under trust law, and they must act within the requirements of the Pensions Act 1995 and the Pensions Act 2004. So the scheme is going to set its own rules. The scheme itself, the firm, will decide the type of DB scheme, career average final salary. They will decide the accrual of benefits and the rate of accrual, whether it's a 60th scheme, an 80th scheme, whether or not you actually can take the benefits out at a certain age. So they will determine the scheme retirement age as well, which often is 60 or 65. And they'll also decide whether or not it's just basic salary or whether you can add in overtime and bonuses and anything else that you consider to be remuneration, really. So you are essentially at the mercy of the scheme to decide what benefits are available, how benefits accrue, and when you can take those benefits. Most defined benefit schemes allowed you to leave earlier than the scheme retirement age, but there's probably going to be penalties that apply, and we'll look at those again over the course of the next slide or so. So the scheme itself is going to set the retirement age, and in most cases this was 60 or 65, and that is essentially the age to which employers will pay contributions on behalf of their employees. An employer does not have to retire to take the benefits from the scheme. It's allowable to take the benefits and to continue to work. There's certain laws in the UK now around discrimination for age for workers, and we need to respect all of those. And it often will allow you to take benefits from the standard retirement age of 55, but this will be subject to a reduction in benefits paid. To give you an indication of what we mean by that, it would be that a scheme that's got a general scheme retirement age of 65 will allow members to go from 55, but there may be a percentage reduction in benefits for each complete year you retire under the age of 65. So if you go at age 60, let's say, then essentially you'll have 5 years of a 2.5%, let's say, reduction in your pensionable benefits. It is at the discretion of the scheme to decide whether they apply that or not. So at times they will allow people to leave early without applying said penalties. So the retirement age must be uniform for male and female employees. There is gender discrimination rules around that nowadays. So essentially everybody will have the opportunity to draw their benefits at the same time. Some defined benefit schemes also offer a bridging pension, which essentially is to provide an income bridge between your scheme retirement age and state pension age. So maybe you're in a pension scheme that has a scheme retirement age of 60, state pension age is 66. It essentially will allow you to take an element of extra pension provision perhaps over those 6 years. So a higher initial pension is paid on taking your scheme benefits between 60 and you draw in your state pension at 66. So that would mean, and in fact it's one of the very few instances where you will see a defined benefit income reduce over time, because it will reduce down, of course, to reflect the fact that you're now taking your state pension. And there's certainly rules and caps that would apply with this. It is certainly not a mandatory facility that is offered by pension funds, very much an option for them to offer that. And it's down essentially to the trustees to decide what they're prepared to offer individuals in this regard. So again, the scheme is determining the rules. They will determine who's eligible to join. And it's fairly common for defined benefit schemes to have a waiting period to join, or even a probationary period for your employment. So schemes might have a facility that allows you to join the scheme after a year of occupation. It might also have minimum age criteria applied. In other words, you may start work as an apprentice at 16, but your pensional benefits won't start till you're 18. Any scheme can offer a differential for levels of management as well. That is potentially the case, so you can have different facilities and different build-up of benefits for senior management. Membership is not allowed to be compulsory. Opt-out must be available, albeit you have to wonder why somebody would decide they want to opt out. There are legitimate reasons, but they're few and far between. And a DB scheme can be used to meet the requirements under auto enrolment, so automatic opt-in can apply in certain cases. It's a complex area about using existing occupational pensions to avoid auto enrolment requirements. Largely that's outside of the remit of what we will worry about. So the general rules of operation with these defined benefit schemes and the way that you accrue benefits, as we've already alluded to, depends on three main factors. Your pensionable service, the number of years that you've worked, your pensional remuneration, basic salary in most cases, and this accrual rate, which will either be a 60th or an 80th in anything you see with respect to the CII. You can see 30th, 45ths and 120th schemes occasionally in the big bad world. So the key thing to remember with this is the benefits that you will get in retirement are not going to be driven by the investment performance of your contributions and your employer's contributions. You will get back essentially what the accrual, governed by what we've just talked about, creates. So the risk of providing you with your pension is not sitting with you and with investment risk. It is essentially borne by the firm that sets up the scheme. They are being told, essentially, through their pension defined benefit arrangement, what their liabilities are, and they will know what they need to put in to meet those. We're going to talk about how we establish what a firm needs to put into their pension a little bit later. But essentially, all of the risk of providing you with your pension benefits, which are calculated through your salary, your service and your accrual rate, lies with your employer. They must contribute sufficient into the pension to cover their liabilities, and they will have certain accrual and they'll have certain actuaries working with them to tell them what they need to put in to meet their obligations. So let's have a look at those three determining factors in a little bit more detail. Firstly, pensionable service. So this is going to be laid out in the scheme rules. The scheme rules will be provided to all members. This essentially is to do with the period of membership. We know there can be a waiting period before you join. Other than that, generally speaking, every year that you actually work for the firm, you will get 1/60th or 1/80th entitlement to whatever your final salary or final remuneration is. And we're going to look at some examples shortly of this in which we will show you exactly how you calculate the benefit you get from this. Your remuneration, typically basic salary only, as we've already said, but the trustees will decide whether they want to include overtime bonuses or any other ancillary remuneration that you may receive into the actual mix. The accrual rate, the rate that benefits accrue for each year of pensionable service, that's where we see this fractioned 1/60th, 1/80th come into play. As we say, we'll do some examples in a little while which will show you exactly how you calculate somebody's entitlement to income. So next up, employers' contributions. So the funding of the scheme, of course, is the responsibility of the company. And this is an open-ended liability. In other words, it is essentially unlimited by its nature. Various different factors are going to have an impact on what an employer needs to put in. But generally speaking, the employer will pay a certain percentage of your salary and a certain percentage of you will pay a certain percentage of your salary into the pot. Irrespective of that, the employer is duty bound essentially to pay in as much as is necessary to ensure the scheme covers everything in its obligations, and we'll look at this in more detail on the next slide. So the employer and the employee contributions will be invested, and poor investment performance, whilst it won't hurt you as the employee, can have a significant impact on the funding requirements of the firm. Other things such as annuity rates, people living longer than expected, member contribution levels, all of those different factors will determine as well what needs to be put into the pot to meet the obligations. And contributions are often made annually, with tax relief being provided, as we've seen in a previous learning outcome, available to the sponsoring employer. So here we've got a company, and we can see that essentially they need to pay in to the DB scheme sufficient to meet the obligations of all of the employees based on their pensionable service, pensionable remuneration and accrual rate. So sometimes you may see that companies pay nothing into a DB scheme in a year. Sometimes you'll see that a significant amount is paid in. And it is very, very common for a firm to have a pension scheme that is in default in the current circumstances. In other words, there is not sufficient in the pot to cover all of the liabilities at this point. And the FCA work heavily with these firms through the pension regulator to make sure that actually schemes understand their obligations are shown on the balance sheet of the firms, and that recovery plans are put in place. So ultimately, this is what we mean by an open-ended, unlimited liability for the firm. And they can benefit from people dying young and not drawing their benefits for as long as expected, people perhaps leaving the scheme, and those sorts of things can have an impact again on funding. So us as employees are likely to need to put a contribution into our pension. There was quite a lot of defined benefit pensions back in the day which were non-contributory. Most of the banks in the private sector and most of the public sector schemes, you made no contribution to what turned out to be a real nest egg of a pension when you retired. So most employees will put money into the pot. This is generally expressed as a percentage of their salary, and you would get the tax relief generally on that at your own individual income tax rate. So generally what would happen is that you would pay defined benefit pensions under what's known as the net pay arrangement. In fact, the vast majority, if not all, of pensions that are defined benefit will see that work in that way. In other words, you pay your pension contribution out of your salary before your salary is liable to income tax. You will still pay national insurance contributions on your salary plus your pension contributions effectively. Benefits are tangible, as members know exactly what they're going to receive and when they will be able to take them from. So you might recognise this graphic with one extra blue arrow added on. We looked at this a couple of slides ago. The only difference here is we've got a third arrow going into the pot, which is members that will pay their employee contributions into the pot alongside the companies as well. And if there is a problem with the scheme in any way, you may find that the amount you need to pay in goes up as an employee, and that has happened on quite a lot of the pension funds that are defined benefits over recent years.